My 4-year-old nephew walked up to me, slapped me across the face, and said, "Mommy says you deserve it because you're a brokey." Asterisk, asterisk, that wasn't even the worst thing my family had ever done to me. My mom, Gina, believed she was the funniest person in every room. She'd spent years performing 5-minute stand-up sets at small bars and proudly called herself a professional comedian, even though her biggest source of material was humiliating the people closest to her. Growing up, every embarrassing moment of my life became one of her jokes. When I wet the bed at 7, she turned it into the highlight of my birthday party. When I got my first period and bled through my clothes at school, she used that story for months during her comedy routines. But nothing compared to what she did at my engagement party. After 4 wonderful years together, Luke and I finally got engaged. His parents hosted a beautiful celebration at their country club with family, close friends, and business associates. It was supposed to be one of the happiest nights of my life. My mom arrived, already drunk, dressed in a sparkling sequin gown like she was the star of the event. She interrupted conversations, forced jokes into every discussion, and ignored the awkward silence that followed. Then, halfway through dinner, she stood up, tapped her glass, and started giving a speech that nobody had asked for. At first, she talked about how proud she was that I'd found someone willing to marry me. Then she smiled and said she had a funny story explaining why she never thought this day would happen. She began acting out the darkest moment of my life. When I was 19, I suffered a severe mental health crisis. Instead of simply mentioning it, she turned it into a comedy routine. She copied the way I cried, mocked the way I begged her for help, and even imitated me saying I wanted to die. She described finding me after I'd taken pills, rushing me to the hospital, and my 72-hour psychiatric hold. She even dropped to the floor to recreate how I collapsed and made fake heart monitor sounds for dramatic effect. Nobody laughed. The room was completely silent. Luke's mother had tears in her eyes. His father looked horrified. His brother quietly walked out of the room. Still, my mom kept going. She even joked about what the psychiatrist supposedly said during my treatment and laughed at her own punchline while more than 200 guests stared at her in disbelief. Luke had never known about that chapter of my life. I had always planned to tell him myself when the time felt right, not have it exposed as entertainment in front of his entire family. The damage was immediate. Several members of Luke's family left the party. Some later admitted they questioned whether I was mentally stable or whether mental illness ran in the family after seeing my mother's behavior. Luke nearly called off our engagement. It took months of difficult conversations and couples therapy before he fully understood that my breakdown had happened years earlier and didn't define who I was. My mom never apologized. She insisted I was too sensitive and claimed that comedy was always based on truth. She even used the disaster of my engagement party as material in her next stand-up performance, complaining that wealthy people had no sense of humor. According to her, I should have been grateful because she had made me unforgettable. Our wedding was only 3 months away, and she assumed she'd be giving another speech. She even started asking for embarrassing stories about Luke so she could balance things out. To make matters worse, she bought a white sequin dress that looked almost identical to a wedding gown because she wanted to stand out in the photos. When I told her she wasn't allowed to give a speech, she laughed and said no one could stop the mother of the bride from talking. That was the moment I decided she needed to experience what it felt like to become the joke. A week before the wedding, I invited her and all of her comedian friends to what she believed was my bachelorette party. She was excited and brought 15 people from her local open mic scene. I told everyone we were going to do a roast where we'd joke about the crazy things our parents had done while raising us. My mom loved the idea. She even joked that I was finally developing a sense of humor. She went first, telling more embarrassing stories about my childhood and making me sound pathetic. After that, everyone else shared funny stories about their own parents. It was my turn. I stood up, looked directly at my mom, and calmly began telling the true story she'd spent years hoping nobody would ever hear. I started with how she'd gotten pregnant with me at 17 after having an affair with her married English teacher, Mr. Randolph. Then I revealed how she'd blackmailed him for money until his wife discovered everything, and the scandal ultimately drove him to take his own life. Then I told everyone about the suicide note. I revealed that Gina had kept the note, the one that mentioned her by name, instead of destroying it or feeling any guilt. The room went completely silent. The laughter disappeared. Then I kept going. I told them how she used to put vodka in my baby bottle so I'd sleep through the wild party she threw. I talked about the strange men she constantly brought home, the ones who made inappropriate comments about my body as I got older. Instead of protecting me, she told me to be nice to them because they were the ones paying our rent. I told everyone how my grandmother had left me money for college, but Gina stole every penny and spent it on comedy classes she never even succeeded in. I shared how she'd been fired from 12 different jobs for stealing, how she'd gone to rehab 4 different times, but always quit because they wouldn't let her perform stand-up during group therapy, how she once showed up drunk at my high school, forcing the principal to call Child Protective Services. When a social worker questioned her, she claimed I was making everything up just to get attention. No one said a word. Gina tried to laugh it off like she always did, but I wasn't finished. I told them about my 8th grade talent show, where she was so drunk she fell out of her chair. Other parents had to carry her to the parking lot while I stood there pretending I didn't even know her. I told them about the night I found her unconscious in our bathtub with a lit cigarette still in her hand. It had already burned a hole through the shower curtain. Then I talked about the Christmas she sold my Nintendo for drug money and told me Santa Claus wasn't real anymore because we were too poor. The room stayed completely silent. Ted was the first person to stand up. Without looking at either of us, he quietly walked out. Lucy just stared at Gina, completely speechless, like someone watching a terrible accident they couldn't look away from. Kira never lowered her phone. She had recorded everything, and I could still see the little red recording light. For a moment, I felt powerful. It felt like justice, like every painful memory I'd carried for years had finally been heard. But underneath that feeling, something else slowly settled in. A deep, cold guilt. I had just destroyed my mother in front of everyone she knew, everyone who made up her entire social life. The expression on her face made me feel like I'd kicked a helpless animal. She tried forcing out one of her fake comedian laughs, the same laugh she always used whenever a joke failed. But halfway through, her voice cracked and turned into a weak cough. Her face had gone completely pale beneath her makeup, and a vein throbbed in her neck. She opened her mouth and called me a liar. At least she tried to. The word came out sounding weak and desperate instead of angry. She insisted I was making everything up for attention, that I'd always exaggerated stories. But her hands were shaking so badly, she had to set her drink down. Around the room, the other comedians exchanged silent glances. I could tell they were remembering every story Gina had ever told about me. Greg finally cleared his throat and awkwardly suggested everyone take a break and get some fresh air. His voice sounded painfully loud in the silence. One by one, people quietly stood up. No conversations, no jokes, just the scraping of chairs and slow footsteps toward the exit. Within minutes, everyone was gone. Only Gina and I remained, sitting across from each other at a table covered with empty glasses and crumpled napkins. For the first time in my life, I saw something on my mother's face I'd never seen before. Fear. Real fear. In a quiet, tired voice, she asked me why I would do this to her. I looked at her and answered honestly. You did this to yourself the day you turned my suicide attempt into a comedy routine at my engagement party in front of 200 people. My words were calm, flat, and final. I watched her face collapse. She started crying. Not the dramatic tears she usually used to manipulate people. These were real. Messy. Her mascara ran down her cheeks in dark streaks as she sobbed. She said I'd ruined her reputation in the comedy community. She said those people were the only friends she had. She said I'd taken away the one thing that ever made her feel important. I quietly stood up. I picked my jacket off the back of the chair while she kept talking. She called my name over and over, begging me to wait and let her explain. I didn't answer. I simply walked away, leaving her alone in that room. Out in the hallway, everything felt strangely bright and painfully quiet. Even with the door closed behind me, I could still hear her crying. I expected revenge to make me feel better. Instead, I just felt exhausted, empty. and like I'd swallowed something sharp that would stay with me for a very long time. Luke called me 3 times that night, but I let it go to voicemail because I didn't know how to explain what I'd just done. I spent the rest of the night sitting on my couch, staring at my phone as it kept lighting up with Luke's name. Every time it rang, the knot in my stomach tightened a little more. The next morning, I finally listened to his voicemails. He sounded worried, confused, and desperate to understand what had happened. He asked if I was okay and told me that Gina had already called him, crying and claiming I'd attacked her in public. In the third message, he said his mom was asking questions and he didn't know what he was supposed to tell her. The moment I heard that, all my anger came rushing back. Of course she'd called him first. Of course she'd painted herself as the victim. That was what she always did. I knew exactly what she'd told him, that I was unstable, cruel, and had humiliated her for no reason. She probably claimed she'd only ever try to be a good mother. I was so furious that I threw my phone across the room. It slammed into the wall hard enough to leave a dent in the paint. The next afternoon, I met Luke for coffee at the cafe near his office. I got there early and ordered a drink I never touched. When he walked in, he looked exhausted. Dark circles sat under his eyes, and it was obvious he hadn't been sleeping. We sat in a quiet corner, and before Gina had any more time to twist the story, I told him everything. I explained how I'd invited her comedy friends to the fake bachelorette party, how I'd set up the roast, waded through everyone else's stories, and then exposed every terrible thing she'd ever done to me. Luke didn't interrupt once. His coffee slowly went cold while his expression grew more serious with every detail I shared. When I finally finished, he stayed silent for a long time. Then he looked at me and quietly asked, "Do you feel better now that you finally got your revenge?" The question hit me harder than I expected. I opened my mouth to say yes, but I couldn't, because the truth was I didn't feel better at all. I felt angry. I felt sick. And more than anything, I was terrified that I was becoming just like her, someone who hurts people and calls it justice. Then Luke told me something that made my heart sink. His parents were wondering if we should postpone the wedding. They were worried another family disaster would happen during the ceremony. Panic flooded through me, so quickly my hands started shaking. I'd spent months planning that wedding, choosing flowers, tasting cakes, arguing with the venue about seating charts. I couldn't bear the thought of Gina ruining another milestone in my life. Luke said his mother still couldn't stop thinking about what happened at our engagement party. Relatives were still asking questions, and she couldn't handle another public scene. His father thought it might be better to wait until my family situation became stable. That word made me want to scream. My family had never been stable. It would never be stable. If we waited for stability, we'd never get married. 2 days later, Gina showed up at my apartment without warning. When I looked through the peephole, I barely recognized her. Her hair was dirty and tied back in a messy ponytail. She wore old sweatpants and a faded t-shirt instead of the flashy clothes she usually loved. For the first time in my life, she looked broken. I opened the door. She walked inside without saying much and slowly lowered herself onto my couch as if she didn't have the strength to stay standing. In a quiet voice, she told me that 2 comedy clubs had canceled her upcoming open mic spots after people heard what I'd revealed. The Laugh Factory had told her they were going in a different direction. The Comedy Store said they were booked for the next 6 months. For just a second, I felt guilty. Then I remembered my engagement party. I remembered her lying on the floor, pretending to be me as I collapsed during my suicide attempt. I remembered the fake heart monitor sounds, Luke's grandmother clutching her pearls, his family's horrified faces. The guilt disappeared. Then Gina admitted something I'd never expected to hear. She confessed that everything I'd said about Mr. Randolph was true. When she was 17, she'd had an affair with her married English teacher. After becoming pregnant, she'd blackmailed him for money until his wife discovered the letters between them. She said she'd carried the guilt of his death for 27 years. She still had nightmares about his wife, calling her a murderer at the funeral. She said she had been young, selfish, and stupid. She never imagined that blackmail could push someone into taking their own life. Then she told me something even darker. His suicide note had mentioned her by name. He blamed her for destroying both his marriage and his life. Instead of throwing the note away, she'd hidden it inside a box beneath her bed. and she'd kept it there for 27 years. I sat there in complete shock. Gina never admitted she was wrong. She never took responsibility for anything. And she definitely never showed real remorse unless it helped her get what she wanted. I couldn't tell if this was the first time she was finally being honest, or if it was just another performance designed to make herself look like the victim. A few days later, Luke's parents invited both of us to dinner at their house so we could clear the air before the wedding. I knew it wasn't really dinner. It was a test. Gina promised she'd behave and offer a sincere apology. She said she understood how serious everything had become. I didn't believe her. I wasn't sure she could make it through a single meal without somehow turning the attention back onto herself. Luke told me the dinner meant a lot to his parents. His mother was genuinely questioning whether she could support our marriage after everything that had happened. I agreed to go because, honestly, I didn't feel like I had much of a choice. The entire drive there, I felt sick to my stomach. Gina met me outside in her old beat-up car. She wasn't dressed in one of her flashy outfits this time. Instead, she wore a simple black dress that made her look like she was attending a funeral. We walked to the front door together without saying a single word. Standing beside her, I could actually feel her shaking. Dinner started awkwardly and only became more uncomfortable. Luke's mother was polite, but in the cold, distant way people are when they're trying to be civil with someone they no longer respect. His father barely spoke at all. He quietly passed dishes around the table and cut his food with slow, precise movements that somehow felt full of anger. Eventually, Gina started apologizing. At first, it sounded genuine, but after a couple of minutes, the apology slowly turned into excuses. She talked about her difficult childhood, about raising me alone, about never having support from anyone. Luke's mother finally interrupted her. She calmly said that plenty of people grow up with painful lives without exploiting their own children's trauma for attention and entertainment. The room went silent. Those words hung in the air like smoke. Gina's face flushed bright red before all the color drained away. Then Luke's father quietly set down his fork. He looked straight at Gina and asked the question everyone had been thinking. Are you planning to use my son's wedding as comedy material too? Have you already started writing jokes about our family? The question was so direct, so brutal, that for one brief moment, I almost felt sorry for Gina. Then I remembered he had every right to ask. She opened her mouth to answer. Nothing came out. I watched her chest rise and fall in quick, shallow breaths, as if she couldn't catch her breath. She gripped the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles turned white. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. It was broken in a way I'd never heard before. She admitted the truth. She said she'd been a terrible mother. She confessed she'd known it, even while she was doing those things. She said making people laugh was the only time she'd ever felt like she mattered. Luke's father didn't let the moment pass. He leaned back in his chair and asked another question. Were you already writing jokes about this dinner in your head? The words landed in the middle of the table like a knife. Everyone waited for her answer. Slowly, she shook her head. Real tears began rolling down her face. Not the dramatic crying she usually used to manipulate people. These were quiet, genuine tears. She promised she wouldn't give a speech at our wedding. She promised she wouldn't joke about our family ever again. She said she understood she'd already caused more than enough damage. Luke's mother gently placed her wine glass on the table with a sharp click. That's not enough, she said. She told Gina she was on extremely thin ice with their entire family. One more incident, and she would never be welcome around them again. Hearing those words stirred something unexpected inside me. For reasons I couldn't explain, I suddenly wanted to defend her, even though everything they were saying was true. Before I could stop myself, the words slipped out. She's still my mother, and she'll be at the wedding. Everyone at the table turned and looked at me. Luke, his mother, his father. All of them looked surprised. Luke's mother raised her eyebrows. His father frowned. I could tell they believed I was making a mistake. But once the words were spoken, I couldn't take them back. Luke drove me home after dinner. Neither of us said much. The only sounds inside the car were the engine humming and the radio quietly playing in the background. When we pulled in my apartment parking lot, he turned off the engine. But he didn't get out. He just sat there silently, staring at the steering wheel. Luke looked at me, and quietly asked if I truly wanted Gina at our wedding, or if I was only inviting her because I felt obligated to. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. The truth was I didn't know. I'd spent so many years being angry with her that I'd never stopped to ask myself what I actually wanted. He reached for my hand and told me it was okay to uninvite her if that was what I needed to feel safe on our wedding day. He said his family would understand and support whatever decision I made. I told him I needed time to think. He nodded, kissed my forehead, and promised to call me the next day. That night, I lay on my couch for hours, staring at the ceiling. I replayed the dinner over and over in my mind, trying to figure out what I was feeling beneath all the anger. For the next 2 days, I barely left my apartment. I ordered takeout, ignored the outside world, and spent hours staring at Gina's name in my phone without pressing the call button. I thought about every time she'd humiliated me, every boundary she'd crossed, every moment she'd turned my pain into entertainment for other people. But I also couldn't stop thinking about the wedding. If she wasn't there, everyone would ask why. Instead of celebrating the beginning of my life with Luke, the entire day would become about my mother's absence. Before I could change my mind, I picked up the phone and called her. She answered on the very first ring, almost as if she'd been waiting for me. I told her she could come to the wedding, but only under strict conditions. She wasn't allowed to give a speech. She couldn't make jokes about me, Luke, or either of our families. And if she drank too much, my cousin would escort her out immediately without any discussion. To my surprise, she agreed instantly. No arguing, no excuses, no attempts to negotiate. Somehow, that worried me even more than if she'd fought me. 3 days later, while I was at work, my wedding planner called. I could hear the panic in her voice before she even explained what had happened. She told me Gina had contacted her directly to ask about the microphones at the reception. She wanted to know how the sound system worked and when would be the best time to use it. My entire body filled with rage. Just 2 days earlier, she'd promised me she wouldn't give a speech. I left work immediately and drove straight to her apartment without calling first. I knew that if I warned her I was coming, she'd have time to invent another excuse. She answered the door, wearing sweatpants with her hair a complete mess. I walked right past her into the apartment. When I confronted her about calling the wedding planner, she immediately raised her hands and insisted she'd only wanted to sing us a song. "It isn't a speech," she said. "It's just a musical tribute." I looked her straight in the eye and told her I didn't believe her. I knew she was planning another performance. Another moment where she'd make the entire wedding about herself. Standing in her cluttered living room, surrounded by notebooks full of comedy material, I gave her one final warning. "If you do anything at that wedding to draw attention to yourself, I'll never speak to you again." She burst into tears. She accused me of being cruel and said she only wanted to celebrate her only daughter's wedding. She said I was treating her like a criminal. I didn't move. I didn't soften my voice. I simply told her the truth. "Your idea of celebrating has always been humiliating me. I'm not going to let that happen again." She slowly collapsed onto the couch and buried her face in her hands. For a brief second, I almost felt sorry for her. Then I remembered my engagement party. I remembered her lying on the floor, reenacting my suicide attempt while making fake heart monitor sounds for laughs. The sympathy disappeared. I walked out without saying goodbye. From there, I drove straight to Luke's apartment and told him everything that had happened. He listened quietly before suggesting something I never imagined we'd have to do. "We should hire security," he said, "specifically to keep an eye on Gina." As ridiculous as it sounded, I knew he was right. While I was still there, Luke's parents called. After hearing what had happened, they immediately offered to pay for the security themselves because they no longer trusted Gina either. I accepted. For the first time, I realized protecting my wedding day meant treating my own mother like a possible threat. The rest of the evening, Luke and I sat together researching security companies and explaining our situation over the phone. As practical as it all was, I couldn't shake the sadness. I felt relieved knowing we'd taken precautions. But I also couldn't ignore how heartbreaking it was that this was what my life had become. 3 days before the wedding, I received a message on social media from Ted, one of Gina's comedian friends who had been at the fake bachelorette party. He said he needed to talk to me about something important and asked if we could meet for coffee. At first, I almost ignored the message, but something about it made me curious, so I agreed. We met at a small coffee shop near my apartment. Ted looked uncomfortable from the moment he sat down. He spent nearly a full minute stirring his coffee before finally speaking. He told me Gina had been calling everyone from her comedy circle, asking them to come to my wedding and support her. He didn't know exactly what she was planning, but he had a bad feeling. Then he admitted something else. He said he felt guilty for never speaking up about the way she'd treated me over the years. I thanked him for telling me and left the cafe with a sinking feeling in my stomach. No matter how many boundaries I set, I knew Gina was going to try something. I drove straight to her apartment. This time, I didn't even wait for her to invite me inside before confronting her about inviting her comedian friends to my wedding. To my surprise, she completely fell apart. Not the fake tears she usually cried to get sympathy. These were real. She sobbed so hard that her entire body shook. Through her tears, she admitted she couldn't bear the thought of being alone at an event where everyone would judge her. She knew she destroyed our relationship. She knew she'd hurt me, but she said she was still my mother, and she was terrified of being completely shut out of my life forever. I stood there watching her break down. It made me uncomfortable. It had always been easier to hate her when she acted cruel and selfish. Seeing her vulnerable made everything much more complicated. She confessed that she didn't know how to attend my wedding without having her comedy friends there as emotional support. She was afraid of facing Luke's family alone after everything she'd done. The next day, Luke and I scheduled an emergency session with our therapist. For the first time, I admitted out loud that I was afraid of becoming like Gina. I was terrified of turning into someone who hurts people and then convinces themselves it was justified. The therapist gently pointed out something I'd never considered. The fact that I was worried about becoming like Gina meant I already wasn't. Gina never questioned her behavior. She never stopped to think about how deeply she'd hurt other people. I did. Luke reached across the room and took my hand. He told me he loved me. He trusted me. But he needed to know that I would never use his deepest vulnerabilities against him the way Gina had used mine. Without hesitation, I promised him I never would. And I meant every word. Still, I couldn't ignore the fact that I'd crossed a line too. At the fake bachelorette party, I'd exposed Gina's darkest secrets in front of everyone she knew. No matter how justified it felt at the time, I knew I had to find a better way forward. We left therapy with a clear plan for the wedding and firm boundaries for Gina. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that something might still go wrong. The night before the wedding, I sat alone at my kitchen table. Luke was staying at his parents' house, taking part in a family tradition before the ceremony, so the apartment was completely quiet. A blank sheet of paper lay in front of me. I picked up my pen, sat down, picked it up again, then finally started writing. The letter was messy, honest, and far more emotional than anything I could have said to Gina face to face. I told her she could still come to the wedding. I also told her she could bring one friend from her comedy group, but only someone who would help keep her calm instead of encouraging her to perform or draw attention to herself. I admitted that our relationship was deeply damaged. I didn't know if it could ever truly be repaired, but I was willing to try. If she could finally respect real boundaries. I explained that I needed the freedom to build my marriage without constantly worrying that my private life would become material for her next comedy routine. Writing the last paragraph was the hardest part. I had to admit something I'd spent years trying to deny. A part of me still wanted a mother, even if Gina could never become the mother I had always needed. When I finished, I folded the letter, sealed it inside an envelope, and left it on the kitchen counter. My plan was to drop it off at her apartment the next morning before heading to the wedding. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Gina's face at the fake bachelorette party after I'd exposed all of her secrets. I kept asking myself the same question. Had I gone too far? Or had she finally experienced what it felt like to be humiliated in front of the people whose opinions mattered most? The next morning, my wedding day, I stood in my bathroom trying to fix my makeup. Just as I was finishing, someone knocked on my apartment door. Luke wasn't supposed to pick me up for another 2 hours, and my wedding planner had every minute of the morning carefully scheduled. When someone knocked on my door, I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened it and found Gina standing there with my letter in her hands. Her eyes were red, but not from the dramatic crying I was used to. She looked smaller, like the weight of everything had finally caught up with her. Quietly, she asked if she could come in. For a moment, I almost said no. Instead, I stepped aside and let her in. She walked into my living room, sat down on the couch, and held up the letter. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked at me. She told me she'd read it 4 times. Then she said she finally understood what I had been trying to tell her. She admitted she'd spent most of her life using comedy to avoid dealing with her real emotions. When she spoke about getting help, her voice cracked. She said she was going to start real therapy, not the kind where she entertained the therapist or turned every session into material for a joke. She wasn't asking me to forgive her. She wasn't expecting me to trust her. She simply wanted to become a better person, even if it was too late for us to ever have the normal mother and daughter relationship we'd both missed. I stood by the door, completely speechless. It was the first time in my life I'd heard Gina apologize without making excuses, without blaming someone else, and without trying to turn it into a joke. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and quietly said she was proud of me for finally setting boundaries. Then she admitted she wished someone had taught her how to do the same when she was young. After a long silence, I told her she needed to leave so I could finish getting ready. She simply nodded. No argument. No complaint. She walked toward the door, then stopped before leaving. Turning back, she told me she'd be sitting quietly in the 3rd row with Lucy, who had agreed to stay beside her and support her throughout the day. Then she left. The ceremony was held in a beautiful garden venue that Luke's parents had chosen. Rows of white chairs faced an arch covered in fresh flowers, creating a setting that looked almost unreal. I waited in the bridal suite with my bridesmaids while the wedding coordinator organized everyone's entrance. Every time I thought about Gina sitting out there among the guests, my stomach twisted into knots. Luke's mother had barely spoken to me during the rehearsal dinner. His father kept giving me worried looks, as though he expected another disaster to happen at any moment. Then the music began. When the doors opened, I fixed my eyes on Luke. I refused to look anywhere else as I walked down the aisle. Still, I couldn't help noticing Gina. She was exactly where she'd promised she'd be, sitting quietly in the 3rd row. She wore a simple blue dress instead of the white sequin gown she'd bought months earlier. Lucy sat beside her with a comforting hand resting gently on her arm. Tears streamed down Gina's face, but she never made a sound. She didn't interrupt. She didn't try to make herself the center of attention. She simply watched. The ceremony was beautiful, more beautiful than I'd allowed myself to imagine. Luke spoke his vows. He spoke mina. There were no interruptions, no jokes, no performances, just the 2 of us promising to spend our lives together. At the reception, I kept an eye on Gina from across the room. Eventually, I watched her walk over to Luke's parents' table. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I noticed something different. She wasn't waving her arms dramatically. She wasn't trying to make anyone laugh. She was simply talking. When she finished, Luke's mother kept the same guarded expression she'd worn all day, but she gave a small nod and quietly replied. Luke's father stood, reached out, and shook Gina's hand. It wasn't warm. It wasn't forgiving. It was formal, respectful, civil. They weren't suddenly family. They weren't friends. But for the first time, they were treating each other with basic respect. As I watched from across the room, I felt something inside my chest finally begin to loosen. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it felt like the beginning of something I hadn't experienced in a long time. The ability to breathe without constantly waiting for the next disaster. About 6 weeks after the wedding, Gina and I started meeting for coffee every Thursday morning at a cafe halfway between our apartments. The first few meetings were awkward. We were both careful with every word we said, almost afraid of saying the wrong thing. Before our first meeting, I made a list of boundaries. There were certain topics she wasn't allowed to ask about or use as material for jokes. To my surprise, she respected every single rule. She never complained. During those mornings, she talked honestly about therapy. For the first time, she wasn't performing or exaggerating to entertain anyone. She simply shared what she was learning. She admitted her therapist had helped her realize that she'd spent her life using comedy as a weapon. If she could make people laugh or shock them first, she never had to risk being vulnerable or forming a real emotional connection. I listened. I didn't tell her everything was okay. I didn't offer forgiveness. I didn't reassure her. I simply let her speak and work through her feelings without making the conversation about me. Eventually, she asked about the wedding. I shared the parts one felt comfortable talking about. She listened quietly. She didn't interrupt. She didn't make a single joke. I knew our relationship would never be normal. Too much had happened. Too much damage had been done over too many years. But I was beginning to understand something important. Protecting myself didn't mean I had to destroy her. I could set firm boundaries without needing revenge. Meanwhile, Luke and I settled into our new apartment and started building our life together. For the first time in a long while, we could make plans for the future without feeling like another disaster was waiting around the corner. Even so, there were moments when my phone would ring, I'd see Gina's name on the screen, and I'd instinctively tense up. Part of me still feared she'd fall back in her old habits. But for now, a cup of coffee once a week, clear boundaries, mutual respect, that was something I could handle. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't waking up every morning wondering when I'd become my mother's next punchline. That freedom meant more to me than any apology she could ever give. And that's my story. Thank you for staying with me until the end. Some stories become a little lighter when they're shared.